Yo, what's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the YouTube channel right here. This is 2Liter J, back with another video right here. This is the Sacramento Truth Movement. I'm just dropping back in with a little rant right here. Nothing too much. I've been putting this video off for like the last couple days now, but I just got off work, so I'm gonna unwind and not want to do the video, so I thought I would just do it and get it out of the way, if you understand what I'm saying. So with that, I do have a list of videos that I want to do in, a similar format to this one. And so, I'm going to do those sometime this week. But this one right here, I felt was a little bit more necessary than the other three. They're not really too really important to talk about, other than this one. But as the title says, or as I'm going to title this later, I just started recording as well right before this. I already had like 3 minutes of this like already talked out, but then I realized I'm not recording. I got this new phone here, so I thought I hit record, but like the layout's a little different, so I wanted to test out the camera. So, apart from that, this video right here, as I said, I'm going to title this, Why I Stopped Saying the Hebrew Name of God, or the Hebrew names of God. We're going to throw in the S on the end of the names, because there's so many different variations to that, and I kind of want to explain that. So, as I have said in the past, since I think like the last 8 years or so, I've always use a variation of the Hebrew name of God. I always promoted that. And there's a lot of people that will call that the Hebrew roots movement, or the Messianic roots movement, or they'll call you Judaizers. And then there's another name, but I forgot what they tie that to. I don't really have any relations to any kind of people that are tied to any of these movements or belief systems or ministries. There's one dude that I know from this channel that I watched, this old lady. She would legitimately document everything this Hebrew roots white dude would do. So, he was a Christian, but then, he followed a lot of the law. So, he grew out his beard. He looked like a Jew, but I don't think he was. But, people like that, the sacred namers, that's what the other word was called. So, I just wanted to, talk about this, because if you use a Hebrew name of God, you usually get thrown in labels such as, sacred namers, Hebrew roots, and then they'll start like dissing you and call you Judaizers, because, they say that Christ did away with the law. And if you're trying to keep it, then you're like diminishing everything he's done. I don't really believe any of that. I'm my own person. But since I was like 18, 17, I've always used a Hebrew form of God, back then. And, I would promote that heavily. Like most of my videos on my 2Liter J, now called Inner City Poet, or I think that's what the tag is. That was my very first YouTube channel. So if you look at videos kind of similar to this that I made years ago, I was like a kid, I would talk about stuff like this. But now that I'm older, I kind of see that in a different aspect. So like back then I would promote the name Yahweh. I would say that a lot. And, a lot of the YouTubers that I would watch would say, the modern Hebrew names of like Christ and, Shalom, I really was into Now You See TV. And I'm glad at one point of my life I actually got a chance to work with some of those guys. I did videos and streams with John Hall from the Cutting Edge from Now You See TV. And so, these cats, like David and John Pounders, they'll say Yeshua, and they'll use like the modern Hebrew names, similar to what people would call you could probably say Hebrew roots, but I wouldn't necessarily call them that. But if somebody's looking on, surface level information, they may see that as that. But the name that I always used was Yahweh. And then, when I got involved with a lot of more, um, Hebrew Israelites, because, I would call myself an Israelite in some form, some fashion. I wouldn't say I align with what all of these, groups believe in, but more or less, I believe in, the core aspects of what they preach, and that resonates with me pretty well. In fact, the dude that I started my YouTube channel with initially, he was he watched GMS, Great Millstone, a lot. So, that's where that was my introduction to people like, Apostle Tahar and, Great Millstone. And, that's pretty much, the ones that, I was aware of, initially. But what they were saying wasn't any really different than what, I was, getting into, like keeping the commandments, the identity of the Israelites, stuff, in that kind of mind frame. And if you think about it, I mean that it's a pretty beautiful understanding of a mindset if you think about it. But then, I got really interested in people such as Rob Skiba, and he says something very similar to Now You See TV did, and what he talked about was very similar to what they did. So like when they started not talking about flat Earth, that was one thing that didn't resonate well with me. But then you have these other groups talking about flat Earth, so I was like interchangeably watching two different types of Christian ministries, because I mean, more or less, if you think about it, the Hebrew Israelites, Great Millstone, is a form of a Christian ministry. But they can't get any recognition if they apply for a religious position in the United States government. How like Joel Osteen or somebody would do, because you can't have any kind of separation of racial, what they call discrimination, or else you wouldn't be able to do that. But more or less, I would call that a Christian ministry in some way. But when I was younger, I started my YouTube channel out initially as I would want to call it a grassroots movement. It was called the Real Ones Movement, and there was like at least 9 of us, and I was trying to get it off the ground with tons of people, this new big craze, this new big thing. But then nobody, really wanted to do anything. And then we were also trying to be rappers as well. And that never paid out. I made like 6 songs, but that's a whole nother video discussion. But around this time, I was trying to do that. And initially it ended up only being 2 people. And then, the other guy left. So, I was alone. And so, I got involved more virtually with people online than in real life than I would want to. But, it kind of panned out well. I like the small group of friends that I've developed over the last 6 years, and it's a privilege to know people such as, who I do. And, and I know they view me in a very heroic way in some aspects, and, you gotta admire that, and if you, let that resonate with you too much, then, you start developing, like God complexes, and then you see other people that are like YouTubers who got a little, 1,000 subs, and people are like big fans, and, then they'll start letting that go to their head. But more or less, I haven't, fell into that, that mind frame. But, excluding all of that, the name that I've always used was Yahweh. And then initially, it was a variation between the two, Yahweh and Yahweh. But, it was either who I was talking to, I would interchange the name. And then, there's this there's this young dude that I used to hang out with over Discord that I met from the Jared Genesis community. His name's Esteban. And I used to have like deep conversations with him. And then he got into the sacred name keeping of it, of like Christ's name. And the name that I used for a while was Yeshua. I didn't use the Yahushai. But then, sometimes I would use it, as I said, like interchangeably. You know what I'm saying? It all depended on who I was talking to. But more or less on my channel, it was Yahweh and Yeshua, the names that I would use. But as time has passed, maybe like in the last like 2 years, I kind of like stepped out of using those names. And, I'm probably going to get into that as why I have. See, initially, it's good to learn because when I was in church, going to the Southern Baptist church with my grandma and my aunt, I asked my aunt because, she's a diehard Christian. I'm like, does God have a name? And she says, no, we don't. But then, I felt lied to later on in my my later years, in my teens, when, I found out God does have a name. And, at this time, I didn't know what, the Tetragrammaton was. And I didn't know what, the four consonants of God's name are, YH, WH. I'm about to explain that a little bit more. But, I felt lied to. And, as I started reading the Bible, I felt somewhat enlightened. I'm not going to, like, not say that. But, I haven't really felt that since then. It was like I don't know. It was like some you can't really explain. It was a feeling, not really an emotion. But apart from that, the name that I used was Yahweh. But since then, I've kind of drifted out of that. Now I'll just say like the Most High, or I'll say like the Christ, or I'll just say Jesus, more or less. And from experiences, I feel like that's more of a better fitting than using a name for God. So, getting into that now, like the Tetragrammaton is, the phrase for the four letters that are supposed to represent the name of God that was given unto Moses. And so, that is unpronounceable to any kind of pronunciations of man, because YH, WH, you would have to add consonants into that to produce a word. And so that's where the predicament right there comes into, because there's so many different variations of that name. So I would be using Yahweh. Tons of Christians would be using that name. A lot of Christians would be using Yeshua for Christ's name. And, that's a whole nother argument apart from that, too. And I'm going to touch along with that a little bit. But, at that time, I was learning, like, surface level information regarding the Lord's name, YHWH. And so in English, the Tetragrammaton in the Old Testament is usually referred to as all capital Lord. So when you see that, that's the English variation to that word. But I mean, if you look it up, you'll find an explanation on it. But so there's an issue there, because the ancient Jews, they viewed God's name as very sacred, to where it was unpronounceable. And the name that they were focusing on, which I don't think we really can agree upon what that was sacred, and they didn't use it. And that's very similar to what the Jews today do as well. They don't say the name of God. They'll call him Hashem, or they'll say Adonai, which is father, and like Hashem is like, I think means the name or sacred name or something. but I believe it's the name. So when you watch, there's this channel that I watch. It's called forgot its name, but the last guy's name is, I believe, Schuster. But anyway, what he does, Brandon Schuster, I think that's what it is. Because I know a guy named Brian Schuster, but that's a different dude. And he goes around Israel and interviewing all these rabbinic Hasidic Jews and secular Jews and non-religious Jews. And when you hear him talk, these are phrases and, stuff, they say. And he also asks them questions that people all around the world have for them. And, it's crazy because you'll get like the idea of where they're coming from on YouTube, where you don't got to go off the platform to view these on alternative free speech websites like Rumble or BitChute, because stuff gets removed. So it's always interesting to see right there. And so they say Adonai or Hashem, but they don't really ever say the name of God. And so, when you come to the Christian aspect of the Bible, they all have different names, including, the Hebrew Israelites. So, as I mentioned, the YHWH, in order to pronounce that, you have to add letters in between those. So, the most agreed upon would be Yahweh. And, that consists of 4 Hebrew letters, the Yod, the He, the Wah, and He. It's 4 Hebrew letters. And there's some people who say that, the 4 letters spelt out and sounded out just using the Hebrew alphabet. So they would say Yod, He, Wah, He. So putting that on the record, we have 2 variations of the name right there. So you have Yahweh, Yod, He, Wah, He. I've heard that used before. And so you got 2, all right? And so here's another one. You'll hear Yahuwah a lot. And so that's 3, Y-A-H-U-A-H. And then you have Yahuwah, Y-A-H-U-W-A-H. So that's 4, all right? Then you have Yahweh. All right, now that's 5. And then there's this channel that I watch. They do videos exposing, what's his name? Flat Earth Asshole, Jake the Flat Earth Asshole. And they're like a small Christian group, but they also say Yahweh. But they add an A at the end of it, so it's Yahweh. So, I don't know, that's like 6 now, you know what I'm saying? But I don't know if that's like widely used. That just might be something that they say. But, so you got, I-E-O-U, vowels, Yahweh, Yahuwah, and then there's, Yehovah. There's some people that add an O, so it's Y-A-H-O-W-A-H, Yehovah, alright? So you have Yahweh, Yahuwah, Yehovah, and then, there's Yahweh's usually with the Hebrew Israelites. And then a lot of the Hebrew roots people, they say Yahuwah based off, my firsthand experience with people like that. But there's another like small splinter group of like different Israelites that use a different form of God's name. They say Ahaya. So that's nearly 10. I lost count just, saying all these. So, it's interesting when you think about it, because none of these groups can really agree upon, a common name to use for the Lord. And if you think about it, this is the Lord's doing, the division that's being in effect right here. And in truth, I would say a lot of this comes from, the Lord. This would be his own doing. And, just by leading from example based off of what I just said so far, and, I'm going to get into the rest of it, but I just want to make this a little statement, is that, this is from the Lord's doing, the confusing of the tongue, of the languages of the people, from Genesis. That was done by the Lord. The Most High did that himself. So, this would be, a good small example of a situation very similar to that, if not the same situation. Because you have all these different religious groups, religious teachings, and ministries that have different forms of the Tetragrammaton. The YHWH, the name of the Lord, the name of the Most High Father. And so, I just named like 10, all right? And there's probably more, but, these are what, I know off my hand. And, so the YHWH comes from ancient Hebrew, ancient Paleo-Hebrew, very similar to the Phoenician languages, or the Phoenician language, not languages. I wanted to say Chaldean, but I don't know if that would be accurate. But I know Phoenician is very similar to ancient Paleo. But now you have another predicament, is because the Israelites, the Hebrew Israelites, they don't work off of the Masoretic manuscripts that translated the modern Hebrew of today, where people would use like Yeshua, and what you would hear in Israel today. The Masoretic text was a manuscript that was supposedly ancient Paleo Hebrew that was later used to how would you say transcribe that into modern Hebrew. So the Israelites don't use that. So that's a predicament right there now. So they use the Lashon Kodash, which is another form of ancient Paleo Hebrew. Now, not too much you can find about it online, which is, fairly odd. Like, myself, I don't know like a pinpoint time on when this was, supposedly transcribed. But I do know, the Israelites go back to, in New York, of the One West Christian Church. And so maybe, there's a connection there between, the Lashon. But, I really don't know off the top. And, I don't think a lot of Israelites do, too. Because if you look at the Israelites of today, they're more focused on future, events. But, they don't really know, like, the history or, can preach about any past big-time Israelites or even where their ministry would derive from. Maybe they do, but, they don't really talk about it. They preach the doctrine, but they're more focused on the now and, not the past. And so, that I just find that very interesting right there. But, excluding that, so, you have a situation right there between two different types of situations. You have the Masoretic text, which supposedly is more ancient than, the Lashon. But, working off of that, though, how you have two manuscripts of, transcribing ancient Paleo Hebrew, and then, you can find a lot of forms of, God's name in these. And, what's interesting is, using, the ancient Paleo Hebrew, using the ancient Paleo Hebrew, it will later get Latinized. So, the four consonants would be YHWH. But then later on, some letters would change. So instead of Yod-He, Wah-He, you would have Yod-He, Vav-He. So the Wah later became a Vav. So W-A-W would later be V-A-V. So, if you're thinking about it, you have another form of Hebrew, now Latinized. It's Yod-He, Vav-He. And then, you have people having YHWH. Now it says YHVH. And so, you have another form of YHVH. And, the pronunciation to that is Yehovah. And, that's really mainly used in a lot of, Eastern European countries today. But, Yehovah is another form of Jehovah. Like Jehovah's Witnesses. Which is, funny because, I think like a year ago, I had a conversation with these with these Jehovah's Witnesses. I had a conversation with these Jehovah's Witnesses because where I work at, legitimately all throughout the week, they pop up with, these flyers and pamphlets and, these stands, and, they are on legitimately every corner. So, I've had a bit of conversations with them. And, I would agree on some of the stuff they talk about, such as, hell not being eternal, no alternative dimension of people burning forever, Christ not being the Father, the Trinity. I don't believe in that. So, there's a lot of stuff that we talked about that I would agree upon. And, when I started talking to them about the name they use, they don't really know what I'm talking about. So when I started explaining, the Latinized version of YHWH, now YHVH, they were Ukrainian women, Ukrainian girls. They're probably about a little bit younger than me, or about maybe my age, probably about 20. And so, as I was talking to them, I was talking about Jehovah, but then I used the name Yehovah, and they were a little bit interested then, because this is the name that they say in Ukrainian. I believe so, as what they told me. But I don't think they really understood where I was going. But yeah, they do. They said they do say that name, but I think it's just based off of language boundaries more than actually trying to find the name of God. But you have a predicament there, because all in end, you have so many variations of the Lord's name. Which one do you use? And it's divisive, but then also the division comes from God. So this is His doing, and and wholeheartedly, you have names for Jesus as well. Jesus, Iesus, with the Greek version of Jesus, Yeshua, and then you have Yahshua, Yashua, Yahshua, and then you have Yahushua, I forgot how to spell it, Yahushua, Yahushua, and then you have Yehoshua, and it's a O, as like, I said earlier with the Lord's name, and then you have Yahushai, and then, there's another one, but I forgot what it was. But, right there, now you have, like, many different names, like Christ. So, it's a predicament there, and it don't really make too much sense when you have this too many arguments going on. And so, another thing with the Tetragrammaton, there's people out here, Christians, I mind you, and they'll say that this name is actually satanic. I don't believe that necessarily, but they'll say that the name is actually witchcraft. And you're invoking demons when you start doing this, and that's just another argument they give. And then you have people like Pastor Steven Anderson. He has a strong dislike of anything that would be considered Judaized or even Israelite. I mind you there. So he says the name Jehovah, and he'll clearly preach that. But there's flaws in that belief system, and so ancient Paleo Hebrew never had a V. It definitely was a W. Just throw that out there, so that's the flaw right there. And so nobody can make up and agree on one thing. There's so many forms. It's you could probably base it off of faith that you might have the right name, but in truth, I don't think you can really know to say for sure if you actually have the right name. So, as I mentioned, I used to use a form of a name, but as of now, I'm probably just going to use Christ, Jesus, as, that's most commonly used. And, I've gone off. I don't really say Yahweh or Yahweh or Yahuwah anymore. Maybe like when I'm greeting somebody or I'm joining a panel, and that's what they call them. I'll use that. But for the most part, I'll just say the God or, the Most High. And so, you probably have noticed that so far. I don't know if anybody has. And, in truth, I don't think, we really can agree on any name for the Father. I don't think, the four letters are satanic. And a lot of people, a lot of Christians, if, they don't know anything, or, they follow, nonsense, everything to them is satanic. But, there legitimately are things that are satanic. But the things that are not, and the things that they're ignorant to, they'll label as satanic, which is, pretty stupid. But, I mind you, that is today's day and age. Ignorance is very bliss, out here. And you'll start seeing that more often if you know what you're seeing, know what you're looking for. But, I wanted to elaborate on something that I've mentioned in, like, previous streams that I have. So, this story that I'm going to elaborate on is not new. But so yeah, the story that I'm about to, a little elaborate on is not new. If you watch some of my past streams I've done in the last couple years, you'll hear this frequently when I start talking about like paranormal experiences. I've told this to people over Discord, like Grace Through Faith or LOP, mostly LOP, or Drew, Defender of Truth, from the comments. That's Drew. But a little over a year ago, when my dad was still alive, I was in my room. I think I was playing video games, but, I turned the TV off. So, it was still on, but, like nothing was there. So, but there was no light on. But, I all the names that I've mentioned in this video, I wrote them all down on a piece of paper, in a form of an order. And, as I was doing this, I told myself, in my surroundings of my room that, I'm going to be calling on any of these names. And if, any of these names, are, listening, manifest, show yourself. And, as I start saying all these names, going down the list, I'm saying them for about maybe like 30 seconds. And then I say them like in different order. I'll say the first one I wrote, then I'll say the second one, and then like the fifth one. And, as I'm saying all these names, my environment, like when you are in a space, in a room, you can feel the environment. But it was a normal experience as to like maybe how your room feels watching this video. And as I was doing this, saying all these different names of God and Christ, the environment absolutely switched to where, the hair on my arm and, back of my neck started, goosebumps, there we go. There was nothing to change the coldness in the room. But my room got, the temperature was like cold, like opening a refrigerator or like walking into a walk-in freezer, like kind of cold, no longer like room temperature. It's like cold air, like if it's like 50 degrees outside. And so, I mind you, I'm feeling this and I'm noticing this. So I stopped reading this stuff and, I'm kind of I'm not a slob, but, like sometimes my room will, be a little bit messy. And I had this Walmart bag right by my dresser, directly under my TV where I have my dresser on. And I'm sitting in a chair similar to how I'm sitting right here in this one. And, I got this paper and I'm reading these names and I stopped reading them. And I mind you, I'm not lying. So, I would pass legitimately a lie detector test, with straight A colors, this is not a story I'm making up on my own. I've said this multiple times. So, bear testament to, long-time subscribers who may have heard this, such as maybe like Kyoko or anybody. And shout out Kyoko, because I haven't heard from you in a while. Hope you're doing well. But this Walmart bag, like, it moved. Like, if someone got hit with a gust of air, like this, thing legitimately moved. So like paranormal story right there. And in truth, you can take my story, maybe with the, if you don't believe it, that's fine. If you do, that's awesome. But if you don't believe my story, that's fine. But take using these different names with a grain of salt, because you could be calling on something that may not be the Father, and in a limelight right there, in a different some kind of something else, something that's not the God, you may be calling on, and that may be dangerous in truth there. And so I mind you, be careful with that. But in truth, the names that I've used, maybe like Yahweh or Yeshua or even Yahweh, and Jesus, haven't really brought any negative aspects out in my life or environment. So there may be something there, but maybe all these other ones, take that with a grain of salt. There's probably going to be somebody watching this video that's like, I'm bullshitting, and that's fine. There can be somebody who, may agree with me but don't believe my story, and that's fine as well. But this is more of a rant than telling somebody not to do anything. In truth, everybody's going to do what they feel and what they want. So this is my self experience right here. And so I, as me to you as the viewer, be careful, doing certain things, and saying certain things, because you can be calling on something that you think is the Father's name, which in truth really may not be the Father's name. And if you think about it, that's kind of scary. But that's really all I have to say regarding that. That this is all of the reasons mainly why I stopped saying the name or a name for the Father. Just call him, the Most High. I definitely, think that's probably more acceptable than trying to agree upon a name that has that a human can't really pronounce, and having many different pronunciations for two forms of a name, YHVH, YHWH. So in truth, this is my my rant, and I'm probably gonna end this here. I think this was pretty self-explanatory from everything that I said. So this is the Sacramento Truth Movement. I'm gonna definitely be back with more of these styled videos. I've been pumping out a lot of stuff lately. I think that I've been doing pretty good so far. I'm working on a video right now. I'm actually trying to compile all these verses in the Quran that explain a flat Earth. So I think that's going to be interesting. It's just a slideshow compilation of just some verses I put over a black screen with different portions, and I'm gonna be posting that soon. I'm back on TikTok if anybody's interested. I've been posting a little bit on BitChute on my second channel. A lot on this channel. There's been a lot of more viewers and new people coming in, I think, from the shorts. And for some reason, some of my videos and my analytics show that my videos have been getting recommended on a lot of different music videos. Like, I looked at one earlier, it said I had 92 viewers from some EDM playlist. And I think YouTube is starting to mark my channel as a music channel due to all the rap that I posted over the years, and it's still kind of doing off and on, which, you know, is kind of cool in a way, 'cause, you know, I'm kind of like get some of my subs getting out. But yeah, definitely shadow banned, still shadow banned, definitely heavily censored. So, you know, as I've been saying lately, share this channel with your friends and family. This page is heavily censored, and, you know, we need all the help we can get. So, you know, send this to your favorite YouTubers, send this video to your favorite content creators on other platforms. Share. I want to thank the light in this dark world, Luke. I'm going to shout him out again, because some people pay bots on Twitter to instantly share videos that, you know, they post on YouTube. I don't have to do that because I got somebody doing that for me. So, you know, thank you, Luke. You know, shout out you. Put a link to your channel down below. Every video that I legitimately post, if it's not within, you know, the first couple hours, it's usually a couple days later, with some hashtags and a link to the video. So, you know, shout him out for that. But yeah, definitely heavily censored. Share, you know, everything that I post. If you like this channel and you want to support, you know, I don't get too many donations, but my Cash App is in the About section. So, you know, yeah, my name is 2Liter J, and this is the Sacramento Truth Movement. And I'll catch y'all later. Take care, everybody.